What the heck is a thing? Like this base over here, it looks like a lump of stuff. It turns out that's not really true. I want you to start by thinking about the difference between two things. I want you to think about the difference between you just imagining something and you telling someone what you imagine. You know, if you just imagine something, it's gone as soon as you're finished imagining it. That's all there was to it. It was just like a kind of aspect of you and your thinking. But if you say that, you made that thing real in the world. And even if you change your mind and want to take it back, you can't. It's out there. Somebody heard it. People can say, you said this, right? And it has become a thing separate from you. Well, that difference between just imagining and speaking is really essential to understanding the meaning of causality. If you think of the world of nature, right, we think of nature as the total causal system that's responsible for everything that is. Well, the kind of causality that operates in nature is more like that speaking than that imagining. The causality in nature is such that real things are what are caused to be. Right? Reality is the very fabric of causality. So it's not like there were a bunch of real things already and then causality happened to them. When we say causality, we got to explain how it is that there are these things. And so if you think of nature as like the one real thing, the one substance that Spinoza talked about, for example, you know, that real thing exists as the power or the process of bringing into being real things, right? The effects of the causality that is nature is realities, substances, right? If nature is one substance, it exists as the many substances that are brought into being. What do I mean by substance? Well, I mean, for something to be real, it has a kind of autonomy. It is it's its own. It's a something or other on its own terms. If that didn't happen, it wasn't real, right? If it didn't happen, it's like that imagination in your mind that just goes away. It has no integrity of its own. But to have been brought into being as something real is to be brought into being as something that now has its own terms. When I say it has its own terms, that's also the same as saying anything that's real gets what is outside it only on its own terms, right? To be real is to be a thing that sets its own norms for how it can and can't be interacted with, right? How it's open to being affected or not. So, for example, you can shout at a rock all you like, but it's not capable of being affected by language. I mean, sound waves might affect it somehow, but language doesn't, right? Because the rock sets its own terms, and they're pretty feeble in terms of what they can receive. So, in a way, what a thing is really kind of like a force. It's like that power to interact with the rest of the world in its own way. And so, what you're really seeing when you see the world around you is a bunch of essentially little forces interacting with each other, right? But, you know, it's not like this guy can just force this guy to do something simpliciter, right? This guy can send its force this way, and this thing is a force that is the force to receive in a certain way. So, you know, I said before, we often think of a thing as sort of stuff, but that's not really right. What you're seeing when you see anything is a kind of force expressing itself. Like this is the expression of what it's like for that thing to be interacting with all these other things, all these other forces, you know, and so things are really better understood as something like dynamic processes of expression, right? Dynamic processes that of interactions of forces that currently show themselves in this way. So it's not that the thing is a bunch of stuff that was just there and that is held together. It's rather that that thing you currently see as stuff is the present form in which some dynamic force is presenting itself. But that also means that any of those things you see is kind of a repository or a reflection of how it interacts with everything else around it, right? Again, going back to that story about nature, anything you see has its place in the total system of how reality works. And so what it is how it, as that force, as that perspective almost, or that set of its own terms, right? How that thing interacts with all the rest of this and reflects and shows its place in this total system. And so that's what Leibniz calls a monad. Anything that is real is a monad in the sense that it is an autonomous reality that, in being the thing it is, it reflects its relation to every other real thing that ever could be. Like the rock, some things don't reflect those things very powerfully, because the kind of thing that it is pretty weak. You, as a mind, on the other hand, are quite different. Like, the way you can reflect things is unbelievable, right? You can recognize how other things are actually forces. You can recognize how other things in the world are kind of dynamic processes of interacting with what's around them in such a way that reflects the defining norm or the defining force that they are. So you, as a mind, can actually do a much better job of reflecting things on their own terms than something like a rock can. But it's the same, right? Anything that is real is like that. It's kind of like a perspective on the whole. And what it is, its existing form is essentially the way it's able to say what reality is like, so to speak, from its point of view. The net effect of its interaction with all those things. But again, let's just take that back now to where we started. Remember, we talked about nature, as this total system. Notice, though, there isn't really any way you can go outside and see that total system. That total system, like that we're inclined to say, is the sort of underlying order of all these things. That single order that everything is responding to doesn't exist except as all these things. And it can't be seen or shown or reflected in any way other than as the order of reality that each of these things, in a way, projects or reflects, right? There isn't any way to step outside these things to suddenly see the outside. Rather, each of these things is a way of, in a sense, showing you what reality is in ever richer or poorer dimensions, depending on what you look at. And, as I said about us, there's something pretty special about the way we can reflect them because we're minds, which actually gives us the capacity to pose the question of what a thing is on its own terms. Another thing about us, though, is that we're also moral beings. And so in our goodness, in our attempt to be good, or at least in our capacity to be good, there's also a way that we're reflecting something about the order of reality that isn't really reflected by a lot of other things. And so we can look at monads as things that, in a way, can tell us something profound about the nature of reality. And the kind of monads that we are as minds perhaps tells us the most important thing about what the causal order of reality is really like.